Greetings, comrades! In the 20th century, the world has seen many military coups and armed insurrections that have resulted in military commanders becoming heads of states. All countries in the world actually can be roughly divided into two categories: those where military coups take place and those where they do not. It is believed that the military seizes power in those countries where it perceives itself to be above the social average, and refrains from doing so where it feels inferior or equal to the rest. In the first kind of countries, the military believes that it is ahead of the nation, embodies the best of the nation. In them, the military is a certain elite order, and most common people dream to enter it. Military institutions or higher education provide not just any education, but the best education. Military service is not just service, but the fastest and most desirable social elevator in these countries. Turkey, Argentina, Libya, Egypt, you know all these countries without me. But today we are talking about the USSR. About the rather strange history of military coups in the USSR. Or actually about the history of their inexplicable absence. After all, the USSR was the successor of the Russian Empire, in which palace coups supported by the military were quite common, especially in the years following the death of Peter the Great. And it would seem that the Soviet army was world famous, strong and victorious. So why was there not a single military coup attempt in the USSR during the 80 years of its existence? Or were there, but we just did not hear about them? Let's try to find out. Let us first define the terms. I will talk only about the classical military seizures of power, that is, military coups. So the October Revolution itself doesn't really count. But there actually was an event in 1917, known as the Kornilov Affair, an attempt to establish a military dictatorship undertaken by General Lavr Kornilov. That very same Lavr Kornilov who would have led the White Movement to victory in the Civil War, but tragically died too soon. In August 1917, while he was still supreme commander of the Russian army, he went against the will of the provisional government and led his troops to Petrograd, with the aim of restoring firm power in Russia, and as a last possible measure against the sudden rise of the radical left, i.e. the Bolsheviks. But his attempt at military seizure of power was unsuccessful, so we will not discuss it now. Let us take the period from 1918, that is, already after the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks, and the establishment of the Red Army. This army has always had outstanding commanders who proved themselves in the Civil War and in both World Wars. It had charismatic leaders who earned the loyalty and respect of the soldiers. So why was the Red Army, and later the Soviet Army, never successfully used by these same commanders to seize power in the country? Was it only because these commanders were satisfied with everything going on in the USSR? Today we will look at 4 different episodes in the life of the Soviet Union, during which a military coup seemed possible, and the reasons why none of them were successful. And we'll begin this story with the actual creator of the Red Army, of course, Lev Trotsky. Actually, there is a certain irony in this. One of the most powerful armies of the 20th century was created by a man who was a brilliant orator, organizer and ideologist, but who had never served in the army and looked frankly comical in military uniform. Trotsky, not being a military specialist, managed to organize the Red Army basically from scratch, turning it into an effective and powerful armed force, and himself into the most influential man in the country after Lenin. Even more ironic is the fact that the military leader of Bolshevism, who crushed his opponents in the Civil War and had enormous personal power for several years, managed to lose in the internal party struggle to some little-known Georgian. So why Trotsky could not simply take his Red Army, overthrow the Troika Zinoviev, Kamenev, Stalin and proclaim a military dictatorship? After all, he knew that the rise of Stalin meant the imminent death of Trotsky himself, with whom they were mortal enemies. Why? Well, because Trotsky did not even think about using the army in the fight against Stalin. Trotsky, for all his virtues in many respects, was extremely naive and arrogant. Trotsky assumed that all power will just fall into his hands by itself. He simply could not believe that such an uneducated man as Stalin, who, unlike Trotsky, did not know several foreign languages and could not even speak publicly, could rise to power and conquer the party and the country. In fact, Trotsky, until his death, was never able to accept that he had lost the political battle. Trotsky was so transfixed by his own idea of world revolution that he simply missed all the political processes that were going on around him. And when he realized that he was being systematically removed from power around the summer of 1923, it was too late. At the same time, Stalin himself actually expected that Trotsky would use the army. Supporters of Stalin accused Trotsky of Bonapartism. There was an expectation of a replication of the French Revolution experience, when the military leader on the wave of popularity gradually carries out a counter-revolutionary coup. But, in reality, the army at that moment did not have any tools tied to personal control. At that time, the Red Army was very young, and in fact it was mostly subordinate to local commanders, and not to some supreme commander-in-chief, who would only rarely visit them on his armored train and give them pretty speeches. Especially since this commander-in-chief used quite unique methods when creating the Red Army. For example, he lured almost half of the former officers of the Tsarist army into the Red Army, threatening to take their families as hostages if they refuse. He also instilled iron discipline in the army by the most severe measures, up to the execution of every 10th soldier, according to the ancient Roman model. In general, this army had no love for Trotsky. Of course, Trotsky could place his people in key positions and thus raise the army in revolt against Stalin. But he did not do this, relying on his oratorical and political abilities in a clean inner party struggle. And he lost. Stalin, Zinoviev and Kamenev systematically removed all the people who could support Trotsky, even his own first deputy, and then removed Trotsky himself. Nevertheless, 1923 was probably the only year in the history of the USSR when a military coup was really possible and could have been successful, simply because the country was extremely young and the power of the party or its leader was not yet so comprehensive. But Trotsky himself rejected this option. I think you all know the history of Joseph Stalin's reign. When he came to power, he systematically got rid of all his political enemies and former comrades. Actually, Trotsky describes it best in his unfinished book, Stalin. As a result of a series of Moscow trials, it turned out that of the 9 men who had been in the Politburo during Lenin's lifetime, that is, in the supreme institution of the party and the state, everybody except Stalin and timely deceased Lenin were agents of foreign states. The Red Army was led only by traitors. The most important Soviet diplomats turned out to be enemies of the people. The heads of industry, railroads and finance were the organizers of sabotage. Agents of fascism happened to be leading the Comintern. All heads of the 3,000 Soviet republics, the most prominent revolutionary workers and members of the government of the Russian Soviet Republic also turned out to be agents of imperialism, without exceptions. Even the head of the political police, Yagoda, who was entrusted with the supreme protection of the state, turned out to be the organizer of all crimes. I think everyone understands the absurdity of the statement that all these people really quite accidentally turned out to be traitors, and only Stalin alone did not. But we are not interested in all of them today, but only in specific people. Tukhachevsky, Yakir, Ubarevich. The famous commanders of the Soviet army, repressed by Stalin precisely on charges of organizing a military conspiracy to seize power. What if they really intended to do it? After all, according to the official investigation, from the testimony of the detainees, it followed that they planned to get together under some pretext in Moscow and arrest the entire leadership of the country. Was it possible? After all, 10 years earlier, Józef Pilsudski had become the leader of Poland, and Franco appeared in Spain just a year before. In Poland and Spain, the troops went after charismatic military leaders. In the USSR, it would seem there was a whole pantheon of Civil War heroes who were also worth following. But no. The very idea of a coup in that year was simply impossible. First, the personal guards of the Politburo, they were subordinate to Beria and his NKVD, not to the army generals. And the NKVD in those years was much more powerful than any Red Army. Second, Moscow region back then was protected by the troops of Ivan Belov, who fiercely hated all these conspirators. He would have surely thwarted their plans if they had actually decided to arrest the leadership of the country and somehow overcome the resistance of the NKVD. And thirdly, we should not forget about Stalin's personality cult. The whole Red Army in those years had been brought up in devotion to the party and personally to its leader for 15 years. Not to the country even, to the party. Personal loyalty to the commander among the soldiers was very strong during the Civil War, but 20 years after it, none of the generals could compete in popularity with Stalin. So yes, according to the official version, in 1937 an attempted military coup d'etat was averted in the USSR. But in fact there was no attempt, and could not be. It would have been doomed to failure. Stalin only used the attempted military coup to remove any potentially dangerous people. Potentially dangerous not for the country, but for his infinite power. Remember how I told you that in 1937 no Red Army general could compete in popularity with Stalin? After the Great Victory such people did appear. Marshals Rokossovsky and Zhukov. No wonder Stalin sent the first one to Warsaw immediately after the war, and the second one was shamefully removed from the post of the commander of the ground forces. There should not have been any war heroes in the country, except Stalin. Still, Zhukov remained an important figure for the USSR, and in 1933 he personally took part in what some historians consider an unlawful seizure of power, which was carried out by Nikita Khrushchev. Actually, the last time Zhukov helped Nikita was in the summer of 1937. He personally saved him from a shameful resignation, and in October 1937 he was dismissed from the post of Minister of Defense of the USSR and was fired from the armed forces. But let's keep things in order. After Stalin's death, a triumvirate was established in the country: Malenkov, Beria, Molotov. And let's be honest, the real power was behind only one of these men, Beria and his NKVD. That is why Malenkov, Molotov and Khrushchev, being afraid of their cunning and cruel rival, decided to eliminate him. And they found their support, precisely in the person of Zhukov. It was the military officers who were assigned to arrest Beria and then guard him until his trial. Zhukov personally supervised the arrest of the once almighty Commissar. For his help in the Beria case, he was given the post of Minister of Defense. But when I talk about the possibility of a military coup, I am not talking about this episode. But about 1957, when Malenkov suddenly attacked Khrushchev at a meeting of the Presidium of the Central Committee of a party, and then was supported by the rest of the old Stalinist guard. After the public scolding of Khrushchev, a vote on his resignation began. 7 members voted in favor, 4, including Khrushchev himself, voted against it. In fact, after that vote, Khrushchev had to resign as the head of the party and thus as the head of the USSR. But he was saved by Zhukov once again. The marshal threatened to use his troops, and the anti-Khrushchev opposition was forced to agree to repeat the vote, but already at the general plenum of the Central Committee, not just the Presidium. The Minister of Defense immediately contacted the regions and demanded that military transport planes be provided as soon as possible in order to transport the Central Committee secretaries who supported Khrushchev to Moscow. As soon as possible, on Zhukov's instructions, secret documents revealing the negative role of Molotov, Kaganovich and Malenkov in mass repressions were selected in the archives and read out by Zhukov from the rostrum of the Politburo. As a result, Khrushchev managed to keep his post, while Malenkov lost and was forced into exile. But only after 3 months, Zhukov himself followed him. Why? Because he showed his strength and became too dangerous. Now Khrushchev finally understood that if anyone wanted to overthrow the General Secretary again, all he had to do was get Zhukov's support. Besides, by revealing the archives for the sake of political battles, Zhukov became a danger to everyone. Not only Stalin and his cronies took part in the Great Terror, many people contributed to it, and Zhukov had dirt on all of them. Therefore, Zhukov became a threat to absolutely everyone who had anything to do with the party. And the party was the Soviet Union. Therefore, Marshal Zhukov was doomed. By the way, Zhukov's resignation was officially explained by the party very briefly. Dismissed for Bonapartism. Yes, the same Bonapartism that Trotsky was also accused of. Ironic, considering that both never actually tried to go the way of Napoleon. Trotsky firmly believed in his political genius, and Zhukov simply never wanted to become a politician. But both fell victim to more cunning opponents. After the expulsion of Marshal Zhukov and the inevitable aging of the other heroes of World War II, the glory of the army in the USSR faded. The army had never been more important in the country than the party, but after the 1960s its role was especially minor. Despite the fact that the USSR spent enormous amounts of money to maintain it, the army was never considered to be a separate institution, and definitely not a prestigious or elite institutions. There was nomenclature for that. And how could people truly respect the army when its only major campaign in those years, Afghanistan, was a horrible failure? So don't be surprised that the only real military coup attempt I've told you about today was also the most stupid. Yes, I'm talking about the SCSE, a group of 8 high-ranked officials who attempted a coup d'etat against Mikhail Gorbachev on August 19, 1991. This way they wanted to save the USSR. And after all, the list of the members was very impressive. The Vice President, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense and the head of the KGB. It would seem that all major political forces gathered together for a single purpose and failed miserably. In fact, this military coup failed solely because its leaders were afraid to make it truly military. They were afraid to use force and declare a state of emergency in the country. Although it would seem the leaders of the SCSE prepared everything for this. Some armed men isolated Gorbachev at his dacha in the Crimea, other armed units entered Moscow. About 4,000 soldiers, 362 tanks, 427 armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles. Several dozen tanks came close to the house of the Supreme Soviet and government of the RSFSR on the Krastopresinskaya embankment. These troops would have been enough to seize and hold power, because only a few thousand civilians, headed by Yeltsin, came out to defend the White House. But the indecision and half-heartedness of their actions led SCSE to its downfall, and the USSR to its collapse. Again, notice the unusual nature of this military coup. It was a typical military coup, but aimed at keeping the party in power, not overthrowing it. Fascinating. But in the end, none of the coup leaders dared to take personal responsibility for the punitive operation and the inevitable casualties. They had a plan to take over the Russian leadership, headed by Yeltsin, by force, but they did not dare to carry out an analog of Tiananmen Square and find themselves in power in a half-destroyed country. By the way, when Yeltsin found himself on the other side of the barricades in a similar situation in 1993, he did not hesitate to shell the White House with tanks. Just saying. Nevertheless, even if such an order had been given by the SCSE in 1991, I am not certain that it would have been carried out. According to numerous rumors, The two generals who were directly responsible for the execution of the order told the Minister of Defense in advance that they would not participate in the operation. But okay, the reluctance to shoot at civilians is quite easy to justify. But after seizing the power, the members of the State Committee did nothing at all. They did not present any clear economic program, did not explain how they were going to save the country from the crisis and food shortages, promising only to establish an ephemeral order. The SCSE took control of television and other media, but could not draw any advantage from this resource, not even to get its point of view across to the population. It turned out that over decades of stagnation, even the heads of security agencies had lost the ability to act sharply and decisively. At 5 AM on August 21st, a meeting of the Collegium of the Ministry of Defense was held. During the meeting, Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov tried to call his subordinates to order, but the generals openly opposed him and the minister was forced to order the withdrawal of troops from Moscow, which meant the defeat of the conspirators. So, here's this paradoxical story. In those years where the Red Army was really strong and powerful, its superiors did not even think about taking power in the country by force. And when it was at its worst, its head finally decided to organize a coup. A coup not to overthrow, but to maintain power. And achieved quite the opposite. His attempt served as a catalyst for the collapse of the entire structure of the USSR, the party which served as the backbone of the Union, and all the governmental institutions.